Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this video I'd like to discuss Rishi Sunak's fastest U-turn yet, as a rather dubious policy proposal was reported yesterday, only to be pulled within a few hours as other government sources panicked and rushed to persuade the Prime Minister that the idea was the biggest vote loser he'd come up with yet. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news and politics, please subscribe to the channel. So a little bit of background. First of all, I'm sure you're aware of this. People of pension age vote in higher percentages than any other age group. The 65 plus age group is also the only group where the Conservatives still have a lead over Labour. As a result of this, all politicians have to make sure that they are appealing to this age group, but the Conservatives much more so. So you can imagine my surprise when Sky News reported yesterday afternoon that Rishi Sunak is thinking about removing the winter fuel allowance payment from all but the poorest pensioners. Now, economically, absolutely, you can make a case for this. You know, when it comes to payments like this, it is generally better from a purely economic point of view to means test. That way, those who really need the financial help get it, and you can use the money saved by not giving it to people who maybe don't need it to spend on other things. I mean, universal payments like this generally work out more expensive, of course. But politically, it's the dumbest idea from Sunak yet. His proposal was to literally take hundreds of pounds away from the main voting bloc just before a general election. And consider which of the pensioners are more likely to vote Conservative anyway. Yes, some of the poorer ones do because, reasons. But mostly it's the relatively well-off ones who would be having this money taken away from them. My immediate reaction was to ask if Liz Truss was now advising Sunak on economic policy. Just as Lee Anderson seems to be advising him on social policy. Then, just a few hours later, it was all over. From what I can gather, the idea was floated with the Treasury and the Department for Work and Pensions, the DWP. The Treasury reacted by going, I'm not sure about this. And the DUP reacted by going, are you mental? And then they leaked the story to the media in order to force the idea to be dropped before it was taken too seriously. Fastest U-turn from Sunak yet. Might even be the fastest in history, I don't know. But there are two interesting takeaways from this brief flirtation with electoral suicide. The first is that it shows Rishi Sunak really is a political numpty. The policy wasn't necessarily a bad one, strictly speaking, as I say, but it was an obvious political no-go area. I mean, it may not be politically wise at any time, but just before an election, that is madness. This is the time when the Conservatives traditionally loosen the purse strings to bribe the electorate before turning the tap off immediately after the election. Sunak is absolutely clueless. Oh, and just to back up something else I've been saying about him, I've said for quite a while, when the general election is called, Sunak is going to be badly beaten up. Metaphorically, of course. Don't actually beat him up. I keep saying that he is terrible at interviews and debates and will do himself and his party a massive favour by getting in some real practice first. But instead, he hides away from tricky interviews. This week's local radio interviews being an exception. And this means that when he has to do the election interviews with millions of people watching who will not normally watch political interviews, but now they will because of general election time, as well as the TV debates, of course, he's going to be completely unprepared. And we got a little taste of it this week. Listen to him being interviewed by someone who wasn't just going to take a nonsense answer and move on.
So do you agree with Penny Mordaunt that Wales's 20 miles an hour policy is insane?
Yeah, I think imposing a blanket 20 mile an hour speed limit on areas is absolutely not right.
It's not blanket though, is it?
It doesn't reflect people's priorities. People are dependent on their cars for their day-to-day journeys, and these kind of blanket bans aren't the right proportionate approach. But also, it comes on top of this other policy, not to build any new roads as well. When you take these things together, it seems like an attack on motorists, and it's rightly received the opposition that it deserves.
I do have to pick you up. It's not a blanket ban, though. It's not a blanket speed limit. There's 30 miles, 40, 50, 60, 70, so it's not blanket.
Well, I don't think that's quite right. I mean, look, the opposition in Wales is clear. You don't need me to tell you. You've seen the unprecedented amount of opposition to the policy.
Sure, but language is important, isn't it? And if you're going to call it a blanket speed limit, it's not blanket.
Well, as I said, I think, look, so you've seen the opposition from people in Wales to this policy.
Grinning like a Cheshire cat and not adapting his responses at all to take account of the unexpected, persistent line of questioning. It all speaks of someone whose tactic is just to smile, look confident, and keep parroting his nonsense no matter how ridiculous it begins to sound when he is being called out. There continues to be talk of a snap general election. That would mean that these campaign interviews and debates will now take place quite soon, if that is true. And I'll repeat what I keep saying. If you think he will just dodge them like Johnson famously did in 2019, Boris Johnson was well ahead in the polls during that election campaign. He was playing a defensive game, so he basically had to just not mess up. So he could afford to dodge the trickier interviews and debates. Sunak can't. He's going to start off behind in the polls, well behind. If he dodges, then just as with Theresa May in 2017, he can actually make the Conservatives' position worse. But the second interesting takeaway from this U-turn is that the reason Sunak was considering this plan to remove the winter fuel payments was to fund the triple lock on pensions. Literally robbing Peter to pay Paul. Actually, this is robbing Peter to pay Peter, really. Taking fuel payments from pensioners in order to pay for the higher than expected state pension payments if they are to maintain the triple lock. Now, again, not necessarily bad economically, because it means taking money from those who could probably afford it in order to boost the incomes of those who are struggling. But what's clearly happening here is that the government, they don't know how they're going to fund the pension payments for next year. You know, there must have been conversations between Sunak and Hunt where they've been scratching their heads and stroking their chins, which prompted this Friday afternoon brain fart from Sunak. And if they can't even work out how to pay for something they've already committed to, it highlights just how difficult it's going to be paying for something that isn't currently in the plans. The Tory tax cuts that MPs are crying out for. And if I were to give you one reason why we might actually take the prospect of a snap election seriously, it is this. I've said it before, it seems to become more compelling by the day. Come the autumn budget statement. Now, I don't know exactly when that is supposed to happen. Next month, it could happen in November like last year, but it's expected to be in October. But come that autumn budget statement, Tory MPs will assemble in the House of Commons to listen to Jeremy Hunt, the Chancellor. They will want to hear plans for tax cuts ahead of the election. It is increasingly difficult to see how Sunak and Hunt have any room at all for tax cuts. They can't even work out how to pay for the pensions, right? But at the end of October, Sunak becomes vulnerable to a confidence vote again. Now, if it were to happen, I really don't expect him to lose at all. But even having the confidence vote would be incredibly damaging. Because if the number of Tory MPs who support him, which will be a majority of Tory MPs, but if it's not a majority of MPs in the House of Commons, which it won't be, Labour will look at the results and conclude that Sunak doesn't have a majority of MPs supporting him. That means he doesn't have the confidence of the House. Now, it won't change anything, but Starmer will say that this is why Sunak can't get anything done, because he has too few MPs backing him, that he is leading a minority government in all but name, and the only solution is to elect a majority Labour government brimming with ideas. Sunak needs to prevent this happening, and the only way might be to call a general election before October the 25th, which I think is the date when the rules changed to allow just 53 Tory MPs to force a confidence vote. Or he may have to do it at least before the budget statement if the budget statement does get knocked back till November, you know. But there are those who are now thinking that there is a good chance of a snap general election. And if I was to think of one thing that was to go, yeah, this really could happen, it is the fact that Sunak is backing himself into a corner here. Those Tory MPs want those tax cuts. There's lots of Tory MPs who think they cannot win their seat without those tax cuts. But Sunak and Hunt cannot afford those tax cuts. They do not even know how to afford the spending plans they've committed to. And that makes for a very interesting potential showdown this autumn. But there we are. Those are my thoughts. Let me know yours in the comments below. I hope you found the video interesting. If you did, please click the like button. And if you'd like to support the channel further, the join button for memberships. And until next time, I'll see you later.